Also, I use the word cognitive. So also, of course, we see a language as a cognitive system. And that leads me to a paper that my colleagues and I published slightly more than a year ago in Biological Reviews, a very good journal. My colleagues being Stephen Crane and Ian Roberts. Ian Roberts, of course, is professor of linguistics here in Cambridge. And we had a paper about reviewing what is the state of play with the cognitive revolution. And of course, with an audience like this, I don't have to tell you what that is, what that was. And we came up with some interesting and slightly disturbing conclusions, I think. And I quote, although contemporary learning theory has almost completely embraced the cognitive approach, I think you could all agree with that, the study of language has witnessed a clear empiricist trend to revert back to a kind of new behaviorism. And I think that's a very bizarre and worrying trend. And just one quote to that summarizes the cognitive approach to learning theory by the great Nick McIntosh, former head of the department here, and he used to sit here always. And he wrote a number of classic books, of course, and we cite him in that paper. And this is the sort of summarizing quote: the view of conditioning as the establishment of new reflexes or the strengthening of SR connections, a view which dominated Western learning theory for half a century, which is a very long time, has gradually given way to a view of conditioning as the acquisition of knowledge about the relationship between events in an animal's environment. Knowledge which may not be immediately apparent in any change in behavior at all. So we're not talking about behaviorist approaches, stimuli and responses. We're talking about knowledge which is in the mind of the animal in this case. Okay, so learning theory is fine, but what about language? Well, of course, the cognitive revolution was about learning particularly and about language. And there was the contrast between, on the one hand, Skinner, the arch behaviorist, who published a book in 1957, Verbal Behavior. And basically, I think one could say, he says that language is basically a motor skill acquired through reinforcement learning, and so you acquire the verbal behavior that is language. And as all of you will know, about 2 years later, Chomsky wrote a book review of this book, and which is sort of like a little book in itself. And he said that this is all wrong. It's completely different. Speech is an externalization of language structures that are composed in a mind-internal computational cognitive system. So it's all happening in the mind, and sometimes you can see externalized evidence of what's going on in your mind. So completely opposing views, and for a long time, I think linguists tended to think in the cognitive kind of way about language. But recently, and we note that in the paper, that many contemporary authors contend that language is a means of communication, it's a sort of functional definition, that is learned solely through the observation of external events and culturally transmitted to successive generations. So again, it's purely a learning process. It's almost like what Skinner said. So there's a very clear trend, I think, going back to the 1950s almost. So this is actually a very popular view for some bizarre reason. And so the idea is that language is nothing special, it's an evolved skill. So non-human animals will also have some kind of language, logically speaking. And the acquisition of language by children is usage-based, so it's using a large amount of data, just like large language models, basically. So the idea is basically very bit like that.